Hello and welcome to the Beach House 34 podcast. I'm your host, Christine Worth. Welcome new subscribers to the Beach House 34 family, and a huge thank you to all of the loyal listeners. Today, we are continuing with the trial coverage of Darlie Routier, a mother who in 1996 was accused and convicted of her two children in Rowlett, Texas. Now, this case has divided public opinion for literally decades. And part of the reason is due to people viewing the evidence in different ways. There have been conflicting stories from those that were involved. There's been stories from the media who would use like sensationalist headlines. They'd cherry pick details. They would show the silly string video at the gravesite whenever possible. And not many people have heard the trial from beginning to end. Cameras were not allowed in the courtroom, and most of what the public heard at the time came from reporters who just happened to be in the courtroom. Now, these transcripts are a story of what really happened in that courtroom and something that not everyone was able to see or hear. In the last episode, we heard from Dr. DeMaio, who talked about Darlie's essentially her medical numbers when she came into the hospital the night of the crime. Things like there was a significant drop in hemoglobin levels that went down from 11.6 to 9.6, which usually indicates substantial blood loss. What we learned, this further means that this decrease means that the blood is not able to carry as much oxygen, and it leads to symptoms like fatigue and weakness. We also heard more, and we heard about this in earlier testimony, about the cut on her neck and how it came within millimeters of her carotid artery. However, it was interesting to hear from Dr. DeMaio. He really puts this into perspective when he says that this sheath that covers this carotid artery is similar to the width of saran wrap. I mean, doesn't that really put it into perspective? He then talked about the bruising on Darlie's arms and how they were the result of some sort of blunt force trauma and not the result of the IVs being put into her arms. He also says that the same bruising came from something of tremendous force. He believes that the wounds on Darlie, including her neck wounds, were not self-inflicted. And then we learn about things like Langer's lines and how the skin reacts and how people bleed differently based on the injury that they had received. We learn from Dr. DeMaio, even before the testimony begins, that it was actually Darlie's original attorney, Doug Parks, that had introduced Dr. DeMaio to the case. So if you're not familiar with this, when Darlie was first arrested and knew that she was going to be put on trial, they assigned her an attorney, and this attorney was Doug Parks. But family members didn't like the fact that it was a public defender that was going to be working on her case, even though he has and had vast amounts of experience in murder cases. So they instead hired this new team of defense attorneys who received the case sometime in, I think it was either late October or early November. I can't quite remember off the top of my head. But it essentially gave them just weeks to prepare a case to go in to defend Darlie. And one last thing before you listen to this, there are going to be a lot of censored words in here just to comply with the YouTube guidelines. There's many words that YouTube does not like. So you're going to hear quite a few censored beeps throughout this episode. And it's just simply because of what Dr. Clayton is talking about and certain words that YouTube does not like. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a forewarning on that. So with that said, let's go ahead and get on with the testimony of Dr. Lisa Clayton. And the examination is first begun by Mr. Toby Shook of the prosecution. Dr. Clayton, could you tell the court your opinions? And the court says, first of all, state your name and spell it. And the witness says, Lisa, Lisa, initial K, Clayton, Clayton. And the court says, thank you. Go ahead. Mr. Shook then continues. Could you please disclose the opinions that you have come to testify on today? Well, Mr. Mulder of the defense team says, Judge, I think I can probably sum this up a little bit quicker. The court says, all right. And Mr. Mulder says she will testify as to what psychic numbing is. She will testify with respect to traumatic amnesia. She will testify as to the effect of the certain sedatives and pain pills and medication. She will testify. She is a psychiatrist, Judge. She is an MD, and she will testify as to her training in forensic psychiatry. And the court says, well, we will place you as an expert if you will just sum up what your findings are and what you are going to testify to. Mr. Mulder then says, well, if I could go on a little bit more, I can do it. She will testify as to Dr. Resnick and Dr. Scott's studies with respect to mothers who their children. And she studied under Dr. Resnick and trained under him, and she will testify with respect to the 6 categories of mothers who their children. She will testify that she has examined Darlie Routier, that she has spent however many hours with her that she spent with her, that she has interviewed not only her, but family members. And then we will go through each of these categories, and she will render an opinion and tell why it is or isn't applicable to this particular case. That is basically, she will testify with respect to grieving, and she will testify as to whether or not she believed that on or about the 3rd day of May of 1996, she believed that the accused was involved in a serious attempt. The court says, well, anything, Mr. Shook? Mr. Shook then says, yes, if I could just ask the doctor some questions. The court says, sure. Mr. Shook says, so one of your opinions will be about psychic numbing. Is that right? Yes, sir. Okay. Could you tell us what that is? Psychic numbing is a term that is used by psychiatrists and psychologists to describe someone when they have experienced a traumatic event, whether it be some sort of assault, witnessing an assault, witnessing some sort of tragic, life-threatening kind of event, and may not necessarily threaten them, but threaten someone else. And it just describes how some individuals are essentially, they go through a kind of state of, I guess, psychic shock is also another term for it, where they may be somewhat emotionalist. They may remain kind of somewhat detached from any type of emotion that other people might expect someone to have. There may be periods of emotion and then also periods of, again, detachment. And again, it's a phenomenon that is seen with anybody that, or with some people, not all people, but some people that go through any kind of tragic, shocking kind of witnessing type event. And what are the facts or underlying data that you used to form that opinion in this case? Various, I guess, psychiatric textbooks. There's some articles that have been written about psychic numbing, but predominantly, I guess, psychiatric and psychological textbooks. Is any of your opinion based on the interview with the defendant about the psychic numbing? Yes. Yes. Okay. And then also, is any of that done by interviews with relatives, friends? Yes. Were there any other tests performed? Are you talking about in relation to the psychic numbing? Right. No, sir. Is that all the data then that you relied on in forming your opinion on the psychic numbing? No, I also listened to the 911 tape. Okay. And then I also read Mrs. Routier's written statement to the police. Okay. Then is that all the data then that you used in forming that particular opinion? Yes, sir. Okay. Then traumatic amnesia. Is that another opinion you will be testifying to? Yes, that is something that occurs when, or can occur when an individual, again, experiences some type of traumatic event where they may have kind of no memory for, again, parts of the event. They may have memory of before and then sometime afterwards regain memory. There have been, again, in the literature, psychiatric literature case reports. It's also in psychiatric textbooks that essentially some part of the memory, it's still encoded, but some part of the memory is just essentially dissociated from their conscious memory. And sometimes hypnosis can bring it back, but then sometimes it cannot. And again, what is the underlying facts or data that you used to form that opinion in this case? Mrs. Routier's statement. Again, I guess the 911 tape, the interviews. I spent over 12 hours on different dates talking to Mrs. Routier, the interview with her family, and just various psychiatric textbooks and articles. Okay, and then you were going to give an opinion, I believe, on sedatives or the effects of sedatives. Yes, sir. Okay, what is that? It's basically how certain kinds of sedatives that Mrs. Routier had in her system, I guess, at the first interview when she was still in the hospital, of Demerol and Phenergan. And then also throughout I guess, the time after she came home from the hospital, she was on painkillers. Various family members and friends, because of her, I guess, emotional state, gave her numerous pills such as Valium and Xanax. These kind of medications serve as disinhibitors, and if anything, it's almost like some sort of a truth serum. There is a famous type of interview that psychiatrists sometimes use called an Amytal interview, and basically, they use Amytal, which is a fairly short-acting barbiturate drug, and it kind of relaxes the person's defenses, and they tell the truth. Again, she was not under that medication, but she was under the influence of numerous similar medications that would serve to disinhibit her. And while she was being interrogated or interviewed about the offenses, it would any type of usually any type of disinhibition she would experience, and most likely it would induce the truth. And what underlying facts or data have you used to form that opinion? Again, all of the ones that I already listed, I guess it would be her interview as well as other interviews you talked about. Yes, sir. Okay. And Mr. Mulder said you were going to talk about studies on mothers that kill their children. Is that right? Yes, sir. These 6 categories, are you going to render an opinion about that? Yes, sir. Okay. What is that opinion? Well, Dr. Resnick has listed or proposed 6 categories, and my opinion about Dr. Resnick's categories are that Mrs. Routier or Mrs. Routier does not fit in any of those categories. Dr. Scott has 5 categories, and again, in my opinion, about his categories she doesn't fit in any of those categories either. Okay, what are those categories? Dr. Scott's categories are battering mothers, retaliating mothers, mentally ill mothers, unwanted children, and mercy. Dr. Resnick's categories are altruistic, acutely psychotic, unwanted child, accidental, spouse revenge, and then his last category, which does not correspond, is neonaticide, which is of a baby within the first 24 hours of life. And what underlying facts or data did you use to come to that opinion? Again, my interviews with Darlie and her family, again, I guess the 911 tape, the written statement by her, the various textbooks and articles, and obviously the articles written specifically about those categories, but then also other psychiatric textbooks and categories. And what other opinions was it that grieving, I believe, is that the other opinion you are going to render? Yes, sir. What is that opinion? That opinion has to do with everyone grieves in different ways, and there is no appropriate way of grieving. You might, if you are going to categorize them, you might as far as healthy and unhealthy, but people grieve in different ways. I guess I am going to give an opinion about that the events at the cemetery, which some people have misinterpreted, was an appropriate form of grieving. Do you want me to go into? Yes, please, your opinion. That it was not planned to be that way by Mrs. Routier, that they had had a prayer service before, which she was crying. Her mother had told her that she needed to quit crying so much that that the neighborhood kids were going to be there, and that it would scare them and upset them. That she tried to essentially put on almost an hysterical-like kind of happy face. Her younger sister had bought this silly string, and then they had the kind of essentially celebration as if the child was still alive for the benefit of the neighborhood kids, that it reflects some cultural and biblical context, and that Christians are taught that if they believe in the resurrection, that you should celebrate a death because the person is no longer here on earth to suffer, but they are in heaven. That there are other customs and the Irish wakes where people actually party with the deceased body present, and that there is different cultural standards. And again, grief is not something that is a universally applied to everyone in every situation. So your opinion on that, I guess a lot of that the facts on that came with the interview of the defendant. Yes, sir. And then I guess, everything I also listed. I guess I did review parts or see parts of the news media tape, and then also my, I guess, biblical and Christian training or knowledge. And I think the last opinion listed was a attempt on May 3rd. Yes, sir. What's the opinion on that? My opinion is that Mrs. Routier was not imminently, that it was more of a gesture. She did not make an attempt. She phoned her husband. It was more kind of, she was just at her wit's end at that moment, that her husband immediately came home. Things changed. He began, I guess, kind of helping around the house more, that she was never actually going to go through with this. It was not a fatal type attempt. Obviously, there was no attempt. The outcome obviously was not fatal. And that her partial note that was in her, I guess, diary shows her love and compassion for her sons. That her, depression or dysphoria was related probably to not having her period due to the fact that she was breastfeeding. That she had stopped breastfeeding, but still had not had her period. That within 3 to 4 days, she began her menstrual cycle again, and there was a dramatic change in her mood, and that this was not some chronic type of depression or postpartum psychosis that lasted until the events on in the first part of June. And again, what are the underlying facts and data that you rely on for that opinion? I guess her note, the diary, my interviews with her, my interviews with the family members. And again, I guess her statement, and then various, again, psychiatric textbooks and articles dealing with depression, attempts, and postpartum depression. Okay. Mr. Toby Shook then says, if I could have just one moment, please. The court says, yes. Do you have anything else, Mr. Shook? Mr. Shook says, no, sir. I believe that is all the opinions. Is that right? The witness says, yes. The court says, all right. Thank you. Bring the jury in, please. So the jury is then brought into the room. They are introduced to the witness. She has already been sworn in, and so the court just tells the jury who she is. And the direct examination is begun by the defense attorney, one of the defense attorneys, Mr. Douglas Mulder. Dr. Clayton, would you please tell the jury your name, please? Dr. Lisa K. Clayton. And you are a physician, a medical doctor? Yes, sir. Okay. Will you tell the jury your educational background and experience that qualifies you as a medical doctor? Yes, sir. I received my bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Oklahoma. I was also a pre-med. The court says, ma'am, you are going to have to speak a lot louder than that so the last two jurors can hear you. The witness says, okay. I received my bachelor's degrees in psychology from the University of Oklahoma. I was also pre-med at the time. I applied and was accepted into medical school. 4 years later, I graduated from Emory University School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia. During medical school, you rotate through your third and fourth years. You rotate through the various specialties of medicine, such as OB/GYN, surgery, internal medicine, pediatrics, and psychiatry. It was during these medical school rotations that I decided I wanted to specialize in the medical field of psychiatry. After I graduated from medical school, I did a 1-year general internship at Emory in Atlanta. This consisted of working in neurology, internal medicine, and psychiatry. After I completed my internship, I did 2 years of full-time psychiatric residency training at Emory in Atlanta. I then moved to Dallas, Texas, and completed my 4th year of psychiatric residency training at UT Southwestern Medical School in Dallas. There is now a subspecialty in the field of psychiatry called forensic psychiatry. It's basically how psychiatry interacts with the law in both civil and criminal matters, and also has to do with taking care of and evaluating inmates who have either been accused of a crime or already convicted of a crime and are incarcerated but have some sort of psychiatric disturbance and need medication. I did a 1 year after I did my 4 years of residency, internship, and residency. I did an extra year called a fellowship. This was a specialization in forensic psychiatry. I did this at UT Southwestern. This consisted this year of working solely in forensic psychiatry. I worked at the Dallas County Jail. I have worked at the federal prison in Seagoville. I have worked under various other forensic psychiatrists. I attended SMU law school classes. I also went to various conferences and workshops around the country that had specialization courses in various aspects of forensic psychiatry. Since the time that I have completed my forensic fellowship, I have been in private practice in the Dallas area. My private practice consists of both general adult psychiatry and some forensic work. I have an office by Baylor downtown. I am on staff at Baylor, and I see both inpatients at Baylor Hospital, and I also see outpatients. I also work at some senior centers at Baylor and see geriatric patients. I work approximately 8 to 10 hours a week at the Dallas County Jail, where I see inmates who are accused of crimes or have already been convicted, but they need psychiatric medication evaluations or maybe to be put on watch, but I see them solely as a Dallas County psychiatrist. I work 1 day a week at Corsicana Residential Youth Treatment Center, where I evaluate juveniles who have been committed to TYC, but then have also been found to have some severe mental disturbance, and they are sent to Corsicana. And also, in part of my forensic practice, I evaluate criminal defendants, such as Mrs. Routier, and then I also evaluate cases in civil litigations also. I evaluate people for competency, sanity, dangerousness, and that sort of thing. And I also am on the clinical teaching staff at UT Southwestern, where I help out in the community, oversee residents who are in training, and I think that is about it. Okay, very good. And oh, I'm sorry. I'm licensed to practice medicine in both the states of Texas and Georgia. All right. And Dr. Clayton, are you frequently called upon to render a psychiatric opinion, an expert opinion in court? I guess I would call it frequently. Yes, sir. Okay. Have you testified in court over 100 times? Yes, sir. And you have been qualified as an expert? Yes, sir. All right. I'll ask you, Dr. Clayton, approximately how many people have you examined who were charged with criminal offenses? Any type of criminal offense? Yes. I'm sure over 1,000. Okay. Can you give the jury some idea as to how many people you have examined who are charged with either or capital? Probably, I guess, around 75 to 100. Okay. Dr. Clayton, is there a difference in examining someone who is charged with a serious criminal offense as opposed to seeing someone who is as an outpatient in your office? Yes, sir. Okay. And what is that difference? The difference is in an outpatient or office regular relationship, it is a therapeutic relationship. Psychiatrists are essentially taught in our training to be very accepting and believing of what people tell you until you find out otherwise. That is the reason that I did the extra year of forensic fellowship training, because when you are working in the realm of criminals, you need to be able to assess and confront that what they are telling you may in fact be not truthful, out and out lies, and that sort of thing. And so I have received special training in how to, I guess, confront, how to look for people who are lying, are not telling the truth, and that sort of thing. So it's much more of an aggressive type of evaluation and interview. I am not trying to treat the person. I'm just trying to evaluate and render an unbiased opinion. Okay. Are there techniques that you as a physician would employ to determine whether or not the person you are examining is being truthful with you, or whether they are fudging or lying or being deceitful or otherwise trying to influence the examination and your ultimate evaluation of them? Yes, sir. Okay. Would you tell the jury, just give them an example of how you do that? Well, the best probable technique is time, 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 and the amount of time you spend with someone and have it be over different periods, not all like in one day, but maybe see them and then wait a couple of weeks and then see them again. You have them go over the story, and first you have them talk about something that you know is true, such as their birth date and where they grew up and that sort of thing. Then you move on after a period of time and you observe their body language, their emotional state, their blink rate, their fidgeting, their posture, their tone of voice, the way they word things, their, I guess, descriptions, and just that sort of thing. Then you move on to the topic in question, such as the crime, the alleged crime, and have them talk to you about that. Again, you observe to see if there is a change in demeanor, and again, their movements, their voice, their eye contact, their blink rate. A lot of times when people are lying to you, they will look you straight in the eye because they have always heard that, you don't, if you are not looking in the eye, so you look for such things like that, and they will start looking you straight in the eye instead of kind of the way they have been looking at you before. You also look for the changes in their voice, motion, the way they relate the story. And then again, you go back and do this over again at a later date. You are also assessing when someone is telling the truth. Most often, anybody relating any kind of story, there is slight discrepancies or changes just because of the way our memory works. So you are looking for that versus someone that is telling a rote lie. They tend to be very rigid. The wording is almost exactly the same every single time. So you look for different kind of nuances about that in their description. And then again, you do this again over and over to, at different times, if possible, to just assess, whether someone is telling you the truth. Okay. And in the course of your psychiatric practice, are you frequently called upon by prosecutors and defense lawyers, as well as requested by judges, to examine someone and render a professional opinion? Yes, sir. Now, Dr. Clayton, are you familiar with the psychiatric studies of Dr. Scott and Dr. Resnick concerning the categorization by them of women who have their children? Yes, sir. Okay. And I think one of the physicians divides it into 5 categories. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Dr. Scott has the 5 categories, and then Dr. Resnick, he has his categories pretty much coincide with Dr. Scott's, but he added another category and he has 6 categories. All right. Both of those physicians are considered to be 2 of the leading authorities in that field, are they not? Yes, sir, they are. Do you personally know Dr. Resnick? Yes, sir, I do. I had the luxury or the pleasure of training under him during my forensic fellowship. Okay, all right. Can you tell the jury what those categories are? Okay. Doctor, you just want me to list them out? Yes, if you would please. And Dr. Scott's categories are battering mothers, retaliating mothers, mentally ill mothers, unwanted children mothers, and mercy mothers. And Dr. Resnick, he categorized them as altruistic, acutely psychotic, unwanted child, accidental, and spouse revenge. And then his last category, which is in addition, is neonaticide, which is the of an infant within the first 24 hours of life. Okay. Would it be fair to say that we could, I think Dr. Scott calls the first category the battered child? Yes. Or the battering mother? Yes. And that kind of coincides with Dr. Resnick's accidental. Okay. Could you explain to the jury just what that is? Well, both of them are pretty much both of the doctors use pretty much the same description, that it is a child who has experienced, or a mother who has abused the child over a long period of time and then actually doesn't mean to kill the child, but just the physical abuse finally does become fatal. And those children show long history of, bruising, broken bones, past injuries, and then finally there is one injury that finally is fatal to the child. Okay. Is it just where they have gotten into a routine and that last time they just went too far? Yes, sir. And many times, is that not evident when the pathologist x rays the child and can see the broken bones that have mended and things of that nature that would alert the physician? Yes, I mean, it's almost always evident on autopsies that not only by x rays, but just the physical exam of old bruising, healed wounds, and scarring, and then the history of broken bones. Okay, Dr. Scott calls the next category retaliation, or the retaliating mother. And would that correspond to Dr. Resnick's revenge mother? Yes, sir. Those are the two that correspond. Okay. And could you acquaint the jury with that category, please? This is a category where it's a mother who is usually very angry at the child's father, whether it be her husband or not. Most often, the way they talk about it, the mother is separated, or the father is not living in the home and it's getting back at the father. The father may be having an affair and still living in the home. But basically, the mother the child in order to hurt her husband or the baby's father. Okay. Dr. Scott's third category is what he calls the mentally ill mother. And I think Dr. Resnick calls that the psychotic mother. Can you tell the jury about that category, please? Yes, this is a mother who becomes what we call psychotic or grossly mentally ill, in that they are hearing voices, they are delusional, they are paranoid. They usually don't try to hide the fact that they have the baby. They may a child that they think is of the devil or that God has told them to do this, that sort of thing. They are very disorganized, usually before and after the they exhibit psychotic symptoms that are very evident to even usually lay people before and after the and they are basically just very crazy and mentally ill, and that is what causes them to kill their children. Okay. And they generally confess and justify it in their own minds, don't they? Oh, yes. They don't try to hide them, and they are very open about it usually. Okay, all right. And frequently, the mentally ill and the psychotic category would exhibit symptoms that the layperson could recognize readily. Yes. Someone that is psychotic, you don't just suddenly snap and for 10 minutes be acutely psychotic and then snap back. It may be a fairly brief psychosis in that it, you know, might just last a few hours today, but usually there are symptoms where they aren't able to keep their house. They may not be able to keep themselves groomed. They start saying weird things to their family and friends. They might start talking about hearing voices. They become paranoid. They might have very rapid, unexplained mood swings where one minute they are talking normally and the next minute they are crying hysterically. And that is probably in response to the voices and the delusions that they are having. And again, you don't just go from being totally normal to 10 minutes or an hour of psychosis. It's something that may be limited, but there is what we call prodromal and then residual symptoms before and after. But usually it is much longer. I would say months to years in these mothers that they are talking about. It's not something that you could turn on and off like a water faucet. No, sir. Okay. How about the unwanted category? There again, that is the same. In both of the doctor's classifications, those are usually they are usually predominantly teenage mothers who have children out of wedlock. The majority of the children in this category show signs, and actually the majority, pretty much predominantly all of them, show signs of neglect, meaning not being fed properly. They may be very thin. They may have vitamin deficiencies, kind of dirty, not being kept clean. In the category of both these doctors, over 50% actually died from the neglect, meaning that was the cause on the autopsy was malnutrition. That or untreated medical illness that eventually led to their death. So again, it's not something the way that you categorize it, where it's a very sudden thing. It's usually a long prodromal history of a mother exhibiting signs of rejecting the child before the mother actually the child. Okay. And in Dr. Scott's last category, I believe he calls it the mercy category, and Dr. Resnick calls that category, or his corresponding category would be the altruistic. Yes, sir. Is that correct? Yes, sir. So could you explain to the jury that category, please? Well, there is kind of two different types. This is the mother who was but sees that, the child cannot live without her, or she is afraid that the husband or relatives, or there is no one to take care of the child, and so there is no hope for the child. So this is the mother that her children and then herself. It also is the mother who may have a mentally terminally ill, chronic illness child, where the mother feels like that child is, quote, better off dead, and that she needs to kill the child in order to relieve the child's suffering. So those are pretty much the descriptions in that category. All right. That would be the final category for Dr. Scott. And then I believe Dr. Resnick had a sixth category, did he not? Yes. His was again neonaticide, which is the mother who, usually it's a mother who has the baby at home. Oftentimes the pregnancy has been hidden. And what happens is within the first 24 hours of life, the mother the infant. Okay. Mr. Mulder continues, Dr. Clayton, you have been called here to testify as regards to Darlie Routier. Do you know her? Yes, sir. Do you see her here on my immediate left? Yes, sir. Have you had occasion to examine her? Yes, sir. And she has been made available to you as you required? Yes, sir. Can you tell the jury approximately how many times you have seen her? I have seen her for this evaluation approximately 5 or 6 times for over a total of over 12 hours, probably about 12 and a half hours total time that I have spoken with her in this type of interview setting. Is that relatively long, or is it longer than you usually take to examine and evaluate someone? Yes, usually most evaluations are done within an hour to 2-hour period. On some other previous capital cases, I have talked with the defendant up to about 4 hours, and usually it's between 2 and 3 different times. Okay. But yes, I have spent more time. Okay. And have you likewise been given access to, for example, the 911 tape? Yes, sir. Okay. Have you had access to, and do you have a copy of the statement that she made to the police on June the 8th of 1996? Yes, sir. I'll ask you if you likewise have a copy of the journal that contains a final entry on May the 3rd of 1996 addressed to her 3 sons. Yes, sir. Okay. That is the statement in which she mentions ending it all, or yes, sir, or the so-called note. Yes. Have you also had occasion to visit with family members of Darlie Routier's? Yes, sir, I have. Now, Dr. Clayton, could you start with the first category that we discussed and tell the jury, based on your examination and evaluation of Darlie Routier, whether or not she fits in the first category that we talked about, that Dr. Scott and Dr. Resnick defined on mothers who kill their children? Yes, the first category would be battering mothers, and under Dr. Resnick's classification, accidental deaths, again, those are mothers who have physically abused their children for a long time. And then finally, one incident of physical abuse is fatal. Based upon my interviews with Mrs. Routier and her family members, and I guess all of the other things that you mentioned, there is no history of any type of physical abuse. There was no history of any type of physical abuse found on autopsy. In fact, it's been reported by not only Mrs. Routier, but her husband, her mother-in-law, and her mother. Is Mr. Toby Shook says, Judge, I'll object to hearsay. The court says sustained. Ma'am, now, doctor, just testify as to what you know from your own personal knowledge. Mr. Mulder says, well, Judge, in forming her opinion, she can consider all that. The court says, oh, by all means there. Let's just rephrase your question the right way. Mr. Mulder then continues. Yes, you are doing fine, doctor, if you will just carry on. The witness then says that it's my opinion from those sources that Mrs. Routier did not even physically spank her children on a regular basis, maybe once or twice in their whole entire lives. and that she never used any kind of physical force to any kind of excess at all with her children in the history. Okay, so she doesn't fit the category one of Dr. Scott and Dr. Resnick's categories? No. Okay, how about category two, the retaliating mother or the revengeful mother? Well, again, those are usually mothers who are separated from their spouse or find out their husband or the baby's father is being in some way unfaithful to them and the children out of revenge. Again, it's my opinion from all of my different interviews that Mrs. Routier and or Darlie and Darren Routier had a very healthy, strong marriage, that they were very much in love with each other, that they had what I would consider a normal relationship, and at times they did argue and maybe raised their voices. There is over different matters, however. There again, there was a strong bond and love between them, and that there was, and I guess still is, no reason for any type of retaliation or revenge type. Dr. Clayton, Dr. Scott, and Dr. Resnick's third category, I would like to have you discuss with the jury is the, under Dr. Scott, the mentally ill mother, and under Dr. Resnick, the psychotic mother. Would you explain to the jury whether or not that is applicable based on your examination and your evaluation of Darlie Routier? Again, I do not think it is applicable. It's my opinion that Mrs. Routier was very much functional. She was performing regular household chores. She was not saying any bizarre statements or showing any type of bizarre behavior. There was no evidence that she had any type of psychosis prior to the alleged offense. And then from hearing the 911 tape, again, that she is, I guess, performing or not performing. She is reacting in a very appropriate manner. The distress, she is coherent. She is not talking about, the devil or evil or some sort of bizarre psychotic delusion that you would expect from a mother who had just their children in a psychotic state. And then, even after the events, she was examined by other psychiatrists at the jail, and then also by me when I was functioning in my jail psychiatry role a few days after the arrest. And there has never been any thought by any of these psychiatrists that she had any evidence of any type of psychosis. So I do not think that she fits into that category. Okay. And that would really be covered by the postpartum psychosis? Yes. What exactly is take and what are those? I take it those are degrees. Yes, they have actually, depending on the textbooks that you read, they usually are divided into about three categories. One is postpartum blues. Is that also called baby blues? Yes. Okay. And again, this usually happens within 2 or 3 days after delivery, up until like about 3 weeks, feeling just kind of down. Again, usually any type of postpartum problems usually happen with the first baby more than any other pregnancy. But again, it's very close to the time of the delivery. It is more of just kind of a period of dysphoria that usually, resolves without any kind of treatment or anything. They just start feeling better, just kind of moody. Yes. And for no reason. Yes. But again, that is usually within the first month of the new infant's birth. Okay. And then the second category is postpartum depression with major depression. Again, this is kind of when the blues linger on and they become what we psychiatrists would call majorly depressed, meaning that their sleep is disrupted. Even if the baby is not disrupting their sleep, again, it's usually very noticeable to family and friends. Again, this usually happens, most of these happen within the first 3 months of the birth of the baby. Then again, oftentimes it resolves by itself. Some women do seek psychiatric help and get put on some type of antidepressant medication. The third category is the postpartum psychosis, where over a period of time, lasting up to 1 year, the mother can become, frankly, psychotic. Usually, she progresses through the first two stages I told you about, and then she starts becoming paranoid that, something is going to happen to the baby, or somebody is going to hurt her, or she starts hearing voices. She starts acting very bizarre. Usually, families report that she quits caring for herself or for the baby. Housework doesn't get done. Just regular basic personal hygiene is usually neglected. And these mothers, usually because there is an infant in the home and the family needs the mom there to take care of the infant, but they usually come to the attention of mental health people very quickly because of the high demands of caring for an infant. That if the mother is not able to do so in the appropriate way, family usually bring the mother in and she receives psychiatric treatment. And that usually does require medication for it to resolve. And Dr. Clayton, in the case of postpartum psychosis, that is severe enough that it results in violence towards a child, is not the child generally to whom and against whom the violence is directed is the newborn? Yes. Is that not practically always true? Yes, that is in, I would say, probably from 90 to 95% of the time, is that it's focused around the infant that has just been birthed by the mother. All right. Doctor, the fourth category would be the unwanted child category. It's the same in both Dr. Scott and Dr. Resnick's research. Yes, sir. This is the category that is the majority are unwanted type pregnancies, wherein the mother is usually teenaged. There is no social support there from anybody. They may resent the child that or the children, and sometimes they are of another by another father that or they have got a boyfriend who doesn't want children and that sort of thing. Again, a majority of these children are by actual neglect, meaning that they are not properly fed. They don't, they may be vitamin deficient on autopsy, and that they are actually on autopsy. The reason they have been found to be dead is because of either malnutrition or untreated medical illnesses that the mother has just ignored. So that is how the majority of these children die. The other ones that may not die actually from the actual neglect do show symptoms of or evidence of neglect, such as unkept, dirty, not, again, the not being fed properly, that sort of thing. So, again, this is a very long, I guess, or somewhat long process, and that the mother has not wanted the child and essentially has rejected the child over a long period of time and then culminates in the children or the child. And do you think that is applicable in this situation? No. Again, it's my medical opinion from my evaluation that Darlie Routier was a very devoted mother. She went the extra mile as far as her devotion to her children. She had a great amount of social support for her when she needed, I guess, breaks from the children and that sort of thing. That, again, my opinion is that there was no lover or any reason why she needed to rid herself of the two younger children. Again, usually those types of are, you don't just, I guess, one of the children or some of them. It's usually the whole group of children if the mother wants to be childless. Or in the few situations, I guess, where a child has been born by one father and the mother might the children that have been born by the father who she is no longer with and just want to keep the baby by her newer husband or newer father. So it's my opinion that she does not fit in that category either. Okay. Doctor, the fifth and last category for Dr. Scott would be the mercy that is the one that correlates to the altruistic for Dr. Resnick. Could you tell the jury, based on your examination and evaluation of Darlie Routier, whether or not you feel that is applicable to her situation? Well, obviously, neither one of the two children had any type of fatal or significant long-standing chronic illness where she would have felt that she needed to relieve their pain or suffering. I do not think at the time that she was, I think even when she contemplated or thought about committing in May, that the note showed that she wrote, or part of the note, because she stopped before she finished it. It showed a concern and love for her boys and a plan that the boys were going to be taken care of and would live on without her. There was no evidence that she felt like they could not survive without her, and there would be no one to care of them and that sort of thing. But all in all, I don't think that she was at the time of the offense. And I don't think that she the two boys and then was trying to herself. In the event where a mother her children and then herself, it's very rare, especially for women, to stab themselves as a method of. It's more likely some sort of asphyxiation, even such as putting all of the kids in the car and putting them in the garage and, having carbon monoxide, every one of them, including the mother, or some type of gassing, again, in the home, or some type of overdose. And if there is going to be a violent death, it's usually a gun used. But women very rarely themselves with a knife. In fact, most in the American culture, it's very rare. I guess maybe common with Japanese soldiers, but it's very rare for a woman to try to kill herself with a knife. Okay, doctor, that we have gone through Dr. Scott's categories, and Dr. Resnick has one more category, and that is the neonaticide. Yes, neonaticide. And can you tell us whether or not that is applicable to this situation? Well, obviously it's not, because she did not. Again, that is the category that Dr. Resnick described, in that mothers who their infant within 24 hours of being born. So obviously, by the fact that the offense, that the baby that she had was not harmed and was much older than all of the children, were much older than 24 hours old. Okay. Dr. Clayton, based on your 12 plus hours of examination and evaluation of Darlie Routier, and based on your examination and evaluation of her family members, and the review of the matters that you have received, do you feel that Darlie Routier was being truthful when you examined her? Yes, I do. Okay. Now, Dr. Clayton, you are aware that Darlie Routier was questioned by the Rowlett Police Department on June 6th of 1996, shortly after she came out of surgery for the injuries that she had sustained. Yes, sir. And had been given, as I recall, some Demerol and some Phenergan. Yes, sir. She was questioned on other occasions again on June 8th of 1996 and again on June 10th of 1996 while she was under sedation and under medication. Can you, as a psychiatrist, tell the jury what effect that medication and sedation and the medications that I have described to you would have on her? Yes, those medications, the Demerol to Phenergan, then later on the painkillers and benzodiazepine or sedatives that she was being given over that time period, have the effect on a person to disinhibit them, much like, somewhat like alcohol, meaning that they are almost, in some cases, like a truth serum. There is a fairly famous psychiatric type interview called an Amytal interview, where a person is actually given a medication, an IV, that is very short acting, a barbiturate, and they are asked questions. And it is found that people that are lying, their inhibitions are dropped and they tell the truth. So if someone is making up something, because they are essentially somewhat intoxicated by the medication, their ability to lie is decreased and they more often tell the truth. By the fact that Mrs. Routier was on these medications over this time period and was questioned extensively, if she were lying, it would be usually at that point, under those conditions, where the truth would come out. Meaning that if she had done this, she would have confessed, that sort of thing. By the fact that she was on these medications and did not change her story within any amount of, I did it versus I didn't, it's my medical opinion that she was being truthful. When she denied it, yes, sir. Okay. A good police strategy is to question someone when they come out of surgery, isn't it? Yes. Or when they are under some type of sedating type medication. Yes. Okay. Doctor, can you tell the jury whether or not you are familiar with the term psychic numbing? Yes, I am. All right. And will you tell the jury what that is? Well, it's a term that has been coined by some psychiatrists. Also, there is a thing or another phase called psychic shock, and it's used to describe someone's emotional lessness or their decrease in emotional reactivity when they have witnessed some sort of traumatic, tragic event. Either whether they have been assaulted or attacked, or they have witnessed something, their body may not be in shock, but their emotional reactivity is somewhat decreased. It may fluctuate, meaning that they may kind of go in and out. With different people, it's different, but it's something that is recorded in the literature and part of any kind of traumatic stress that people, again, may, to others, seem very cold and not really having any emotions over it. Whereas what has probably happened is because of the trauma on, to use the psychiatric term, ego, their mind has kind of blocked it off and separated it out, that the emotions from the event. And at times, they can appear very emotionless and essentially just be in a shock kind of state. Okay, Dr. Clayton, are you familiar with the grieving process that went on with Darlie Routier and with grieving in general? Yes, sir. Okay. And can you express to the jury whether or not you feel her grieving was appropriate or inappropriate given the circumstances? I feel like her grieving was appropriate. Okay. Do people grieve in different ways? Yes, sir. Grieving is a very individual response. I guess I wouldn't, if I were going to label grieving, I wouldn't label grieving either appropriate or inappropriate because who is to say? Everyone is different. We all handle things in different ways. If I were going to categorize it, I would categorize it to healthy and unhealthy grieving. Some people are very stoic and don't elicit a lot of emotion. And more private people, sometimes that is cultural, sometimes it's individual. Other people are more, I guess, loud, wailing and sobbing, kind of throw their body over the caskets and that type of grieving. And again, it's somewhat of an individual and somewhat of a cultural response. Some people kind of, I guess what I would call wax and wane, meaning that at some points they are very in touch with grieving and emotion, and at other points they aren't. Again, I think some of that has to do with medication. When someone is very, very upset, the family and friends respond. And again, it's my opinion that this is what happened in Darlie's case, is to give her medication to sedate her. Some that wasn't prescribed for her and probably was given in too strong of doses, where it can almost make someone zombie-like because they are so sedated. Again, I think from my evaluation that Mrs. Routier's grieving was within normal grieving and appropriate. So it was healthy? Yes, sir. Okay, Dr. Clayton, are you familiar with the term traumatic amnesia? Yes, sir. And what is that? And how does that apply based on your examination and evaluation of Darlie Routier? Again, that is a term that is used in various psychiatric textbooks to describe when someone is a victim or witnesses something very traumatic. I guess psychically, and for the most part, they have no memory of the event. I guess in literature, there is several, someone being shot at point blank range and not remembering what happened right before, or someone being and basically having no memory of it. It's basically a type of disassociation where the person walls off the memory in another spot in their brain and has no connection. Again, there is at times, sometimes these memories can later resurface. Again, these are kind of, a lot of times you are seeing this with the abuse kind of stuff. People literally don't remember things. And then later on, bits and pieces kind of come back. I believe that this is probably the case in Mrs. Routier's accounting of the events and lack of, I guess, consistent memory throughout the whole offense. Again, I wouldn't say, I guess it's not common because most people don't go through, hopefully, those kind of traumatic events that these other individuals have. But within victims of traumatic events, there are most definitely memory lapses that there is no real explanation for. And that is not unusual? No, not with victims of traumatic events. Dr. Clayton, I believe you have already stated that you do not think that Darlie Routier was on May the 3rd of 1996, despite any entry in her journal. Yes. I guess when I say and when I am dealing with it with people and patients, meaning everyone, I think, or most people have thought of what it would be like just to have it all over, or I would like to go to sleep and not wake up and just be away from here. I think that is very different. And I don't consider that versus someone who has a plan is going to, they are for sure going to act on it. And they usually do not tell family members. They are secretive because they want their plans to be successful. From my evaluation of Mrs. Routier, it's my opinion that she had ideation. I think it was more of a cry for attention and help from her husband. She did not complete the note. She called her husband and told him how bad she was feeling. Again, these are not the acts of someone who is really going to kill themselves. It's more of someone, I want you to realize how bad I am feeling and how I need some help. I think that was the case in with Mrs. Routier on May the 3rd. And I believe you said in 3 or 4 days she had the menstrual cycle and things perked up. Yes. And again, I think hormonally, she was very vulnerable to feeling kind of anxious and dysphoric, and that she would have been classified as PMS. And then also the fact that she had not had a menstrual cycle since over a year. She had not had one since the birth of her baby. So by the accounts that once she had, her period, that she felt much better. And I also think that not only that, but just the fact that her husband acknowledged that she was having stress and responded appropriately and came home and the situation was remedied. Well, 3 boys could be a stressful situation for any mother, couldn't it? Yes, sir. And that is not unusual, is it? No, sir. I think that most mothers, and especially mothers that stay at home with their children, either full time or most of the time, every now and then, tell their husbands or, other family members, I need a break. I need a break. Help me out. And I think that is very common. People just may do it in different ways. Sure. Dr. Clayton, are you familiar with the prayer service at the cemetery and the birthday party or celebration that followed that? Are you familiar with that? Yes, sir, I am. Okay. And could you give us your professional opinion as to whether or not that was appropriate based on your examination and evaluation of Darlie Routier? Well, again, I don't think that I can necessarily say what is appropriate or inappropriate with any family that is grieving over someone that has died. I think it is in the realm of normal grieving. And thus, in that way, I guess it would be appropriate in that there was a prayer service. Mrs. Darlie was tearful. Her mother essentially told her that she needed to stop crying because of the birthday party and the neighborhood children being present after the prayer service, and that the children were already fearful and having nightmares, and that this was to be a celebration. It was to reassure the children that the little boys were with God, and in Christian cultures, Christianity, in and of itself, talks about the resurrection and how someone is better off once they are dead, is that they are with the Lord and that they are no longer here on the earth. And the Routiers were of the Christian faith. And I think they were trying to, I guess, portray this to the other children. And also that it was not planned, the party or the way it was. The silly string and the party was not planned by Mrs. Routier. It was her younger sister who brought the silly string and wanted to kind of basically, I think the family in some ways were acting in kind of a hysterical, almost a pathetic way, in acting like the 2 children were not dead and trying to almost, I guess, deny the fact that they were dead in a way. And I think especially what her younger sisters were trying to do was that. Again, different cultures have, grief or have funerals in different ways. What comes to mind is the wakes or the Irish Catholic type wakes, where people actually have parties and are drinking and partying around the body of someone in a casket. And so I think different cultures and different people grieve in different ways. And personally, I don't feel like no one can say what is appropriate or not appropriate for a family grieving over someone. Okay. Mr. Mulder then says, thank you, Dr. Clayton. One of the prosecutors will have some questions for you. And the court says, all right, Mr. Shook. And at this point, I think we're going to go ahead and just end this portion of Dr. Clayton's testimony because it's gotten quite long. And the next episode will deal with the prosecution beginning their questioning of Dr. Clayton. So let's do just a really quick recap of what we've learned so far. There's still a lot coming, but we did learn quite a few things from Dr. Clayton, the different categories of women who kill their children and how she believed that Darlie didn't fit into any of these categories. A vast majority of the testimony so far is based around these psychological definitions and how they do not relate to Darlie's case. We learned that she spoke to Darlie for about 12 and a half hours over the course of several days, It was really interesting, though, to learn that because the police spoke to Darlie just shortly out when she got out of surgery, that this might have been a good thing because the medication that she was on would make her more truthful. And I always thought that because they were so quick to question her, that they would have gotten nothing more than an answer from someone who, just wasn't fully themselves, which is true. But according to the doctor, this would have made her more truthful just based on the medications that she had been given. When the doctor talks about Darlie and refers to how the brain reacts to tragic events, I personally completely buy into this. Now, of course, today we know more about these things, right? Like PTSD and the like. So, my opinion is coming from a 2024 viewpoint. And in 1996, this may have been viewed, quite differently. She then talks of the note that Darlie left in her journal. And in my opinion, though, the doctor kind of glosses over the fact that Darren came home and everything was remedied, her words, and that he went back to work the following day, as we learned in previous testimony. Now, personally, and this is just me, I don't think that this was as cut and dry as the doctor is making it out to be, meaning the interaction between Darlie and Darren and how Darlie might have felt on the day when Darren went back to work. Maybe we'll learn about that in future testimony from Darlie herself. I don't know. When the doctor does talk about grieving and how everyone grieves differently, again, my opinion, but I agree with this 100%. No one, I don't care who you are, no one can ever say what is an appropriate response when they're grieving. We all grieve differently. And that's kind of where we left off in this episode. So I want to thank you all so much for listening. You are all so very, very appreciated. Within the show notes or in the YouTube description, depending on where you're listening, there is a link if you'd like to support the show, either through Buy Me a Coffee or there's something brand new. You can now shop the Beach House 34 merch page, which also helps to support the podcast. Plus, you can get a sweatshirt, a t-shirt, something you want to wear. And as time goes on, more designs are going to be added to the shop. Another way that you can support the podcast is just simply by, especially on YouTube, by subscribing, which is free, by the way. You can like the episodes and even comment. All of that helps the podcast to continue and to grow. And it shows YouTube, especially, that it's something that you guys want to hear. I really hope that this is the case. So thank you again all for listening. I will be back soon with the second part of Dr. Clayton's testimony in the next episode. Bye for now.